Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth webinar in the series hosted by the National Youth Agency in the UK. My name is Pete Crossley and I'm a youth work specialist with the agency. I'd also like to introduce Stephen, my colleague, hiding in the background behind the NYA symbol. He's the brains behind the Zoom room in the technology and he's looking after us in that way in the IT processes. Today's session is being delivered by Craig Pinkney, who's from an organisation called Solve, the Centre of Youth Violence and Conflict here in the UK. He's going to introduce himself in a few moments. Just in terms of some housekeeping, if we could keep ourselves mute, just to avoid any noisy backgrounds, as usual, as we're getting used to in this virtual world. It's your choice. If you'd like to leave your camera on and off, that's entirely up to you. Craig's going to be presenting for between 50 minutes and an hour, and he'd like, if you have any questions, if you could post them to the chat room, I will collate them, and Craig will be answering those after the input, if that's okay. So I think we're good to go, Craig. Thank you.
Excellent. Good morning to you all, but good afternoon to all from us over here in the UK. Again, it would be nice if I could see people's faces on their videos. I like to see who I'm talking to. So as long as you remain mute, it would be nice to see some faces. So Vonnie, thank you. Seen a few faces now starting to pop up. Excellent. Everybody's shy now. This is the opportunity to show me your faces. So if you can put your videos on, that would be very good. Thank you. Starting to see people one by one now. Excellent, Neil, thank you. Deslin, thank you. Few people still shy. We're waiting for you. I've got all day.
Good morning.
Excellent. So if everybody can just please make sure that your videos are on mute, but as long as I can visually see you, that would be brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to go straight into it because this next hour is going to go so fast. So I want to try and make sure that I give sufficient time in order for people to ask me questions based on some of the things that I'm going to be covering. So just to kind of formally introduce myself, my name is Craig Pinkney. I go by a number of titles depending on what I'm doing throughout the week. But I guess in terms of my background, in terms of what people know me as, I'm a criminologist that ultimately specializes within a particular area around youth violence. So really trying to help individuals locally, nationally, and globally about the context of violence and why young people in particularly involve themselves in particular activities, and also how can we prevent and desist particular individuals to stop engaging in those behaviors. My background is also youth work. So I have 16 years of experience as a qualified youth worker. I've worked in a range of different settings, whether that is center-based, working in buildings, outreach, working in the community, on the streets, with young people, children and their families. Currently, I am doing my PhD. I'm 2.5 years in, I've got about 2 years left. And I have co-authored and authored a number of publications, also along with the National Youth Agency, looking at issues around violence, but more specifically the role of social media, music and violence, and why young people behave in the way that they do. In terms of some of my advisory roles in the UK, I advise the Home Office around their youth violence strategies, as well as violent reduction units that have been set up around the country in a number of cities. And then quite recently, I have been doing some work in the country of Jamaica. So I was an advisor for the Ministry of Justice supporting them in their strategies around reducing gun violence. And I think the kind of human element to what I'm all about is that I'm also a father. And I think sometimes when we go into this work in terms of our practice, sometimes we have our professional hats on, but oftentimes forget that, you know, we are mothers, we're fathers, we're uncles, we're aunties, we're grandparents, we're members of the community in regards to wherever we're coming from. And I think to kind of encompass everything that I am, one of the things that I always kind of say is that I'm all about bridging the gap between what I call academia and the streets. So looking at the theorist ideas, the approaches, the methods about understanding the context of young people and violence, but how do I make that relatable within the streets, within the communities, amongst young people in the communities that they come from, so they can understand it? How can I help professionals that are on the ground, on the front line? How can I support senior workers, managers to understand and interpret the information that's going to assist in order to reduce violence in a range of different contexts? And I guess in terms of my whole journey, one of the kind of excerpts out of my PhD, I say part of my journey as a anti-youth violence practitioner over the last 2 decades has really been about documenting what I call my intimate experiences I've had predominantly young Black men. I've always tried to make sense of why I witnessed many of them young men make poor life choices, why many of them decided to join gangs, why many of them ended up in jail, why many of them ended up in mental health institutions or paralyzed or dying as a consequence to street violence. And through that kind of journey of trying to understand why this phenomenon was taking place in relation to young people, we're able to kind of ascertain and understand some critical factors and points that would help us to better understand young people in 2020 and beyond, in order to put things into place, in order to support young people to make the best positive decisions for their future. So I think it's important that we kind of set the scene and understand kind of the context of what I call violence, because violence is very different in different regions, in different states, in different countries. And I think it's important that we kind of have an understanding of what we mean when we're talking about the issue of violence. So why, and I think one of the most important questions that people ask is why? You know, why does there not seem to be any change when we look at violence globally or nationally? Why does violence seem to be the same? And these are the few answers that the research kind of suggests. So, you know, so communities throughout the world have been experimenting with a series of methods, ideas, methodologies, approaches in order to prevent gun violence, to prevent gangs and the kind of creation of gangs and how to reduce them. And ultimately, numerous strategies appear promising, but the most celebrated models are usually led by law enforcement and rely on influence of suppression, deterrence, or both. And what that ultimately means is that anybody that's kind of led on an intervention internationally about responding to violence generally always comes from law enforcement. And we're going to be talking about some other models later on in the webinar, but oftentimes it's law enforcement and generally takes a punitive response, meaning locking people up, putting people on curfews, for example, and a very punitive measure in order to engage in those particular behaviors, as opposed to looking at other types of models. And we'll look at why that is. And I think one of the things as well is to also kind of acknowledge is that when we're talking about informant-based violence reduction can also generate immediate results, but they require the continued coordination of complex bureaucracy, red tape is what we would call it in the UK, that must be supported and sustained to have long-lasting impact on violence. So what that's ultimately saying is that short fixes does not solve the problem. Locking somebody up and throwing away the key serves the purpose of removing an individual or group that may be causing issues within the community, but that does not prepare the next generation, stop the next generation from continuing those particular types of behaviors. And these models globally have proven that this method does not lead to ultimately social change. Hence why academics like myself, practitioners like myself, and many of you all in the room suggest that there needs to be methods and focus on changing societal norms that perpetuate violence and the use of any form of criminal activity as it relates to gangs or violence. So what this is calling for is that there is an acknowledgement that law enforcement and enforcement-based methodologies does not ultimately solve the problem, but it does have some positives in that it may remove individuals from criminal activity essentially in the beginning. And one of the things that we can just visually look at, which I think for many of you would really benefit from, to just understand the cycle. Now, no matter where I find myself, whether I've worked in America, whether I've worked in the Caribbean, whether I've worked in different parts of Europe, or I'm here in the UK, the cycle that we see that exists within communities is somewhat the same. So this is for you all to kind of utilize in your own practice, to kind of have just a better understanding of what it is that we're ultimately seeing. So one of the arguments that's often presented is that wherever you have issues of poverty, issues of dysfunctional families, wherever you have a lack of opportunity, high unemployment, and a series of issues that exist within many societies, young people predominantly feel quite marginalized and alienated. And what that means in context is that they feel that they're pushed to the side, that young people are not really seen as individuals that are worthy in contemporary society. And therefore, they go through a society wanting things, they go through a society feeling that they can't contribute, they go through a society feeling that they're unseen and unheard. Now, social disorganization talks about the institutions that govern any society, so education, healthcare, housing, entertainment, for example, that even made law enforcement and the implementation of particular law and order within particular communities. That all of these entities that exist within communities do not work holistically. They don't work joint from a multi-agency perspective, ensuring that each and every entity is ensuring that communities are ultimately safe as a whole. So going back to the first point, you have young people that are feeling alienated, feeling marginalized, that they're pushed towards the corner of society, living in an environment that does not connect and work with each other holistically. So young people have a series of unfulfilled needs that are not met. So when they join and why they join particular groups that we perceive as deviant, as individuals that may be involved in criminal activity, is because oftentimes those groups provide for them a need that we as the adults in contemporary society cannot fulfill. So young people join particularly deviant groups, and oftentimes at some point in time that these individuals are going to potentially engage themselves in criminal activity. So I just need to make myself very clear about the point that I'm just making there. So you may have children and young people that themselves may not necessarily be criminals, but they may have friendship groups that are involved in criminal activity. And I'm sure that you'll understand and recognize that at some point in time, if they're hanging around and keeping company of individuals that are involved in criminal activity, at some point in time, they may start to engage or at least be exposed to those deviant types of behaviors that oftentimes may cause them to want to start acting in a negative way. And then I argue in my research that if those young people engage in criminal activity and don't end up dead as a consequence of being involved in criminal activity, there's three places that they land. So within a Western context, one of the things that we have specifically in this country is known as child secure units. So that's very similar to a kind of phenomena where you have young people under the age of 16 that get placed in a particular space for their safety. And then after 16, they would either end up what is known as a youth offending institution. We would call it prison, but that's ultimately the difference between a child secure unit and a YOY or a prison. And the third place oftentimes where young people end up, if they don't end up dead, is a mental health institution. But one of the key things that I think is really interesting about this particular cycle is that it doesn't stop there. Because like within the UK and within a British context, for example, similar to America and other spaces throughout Europe, is that young people or individuals are going to leave these institutions at some point. So they are going to leave prison at some point and return back to the community, depending on the crimes that they have done. At some point in time, if they're in a mental health institution, they're going to return back to the community at some point in time. and they become even more marginalized, even more alienated because of the factors that they've gone through in life, but also haven't had the opportunity to have true rehabilitation. And then the system doesn't change, the organizations, the institutions that govern any community doesn't change. So the likely thing to do, this, which is most easy, in order to fulfill the needs that they need, money, housing, being able to eat, and the basic things in life, safety and other things, they return back to the groups of which placed them in that situation in the first place. And many of you will probably acknowledge that you've probably worked with young people, children before, that find themselves going throughout this perpetual cycle. So the question that we need to be asking as individuals that are looking at these particular models of how can we enforce change is we need to be looking more about how do we create an environment where young people do not feel marginalized and alienated? And more importantly, how can we be socially organized? Because currently the state of affairs as it relates to violence is that we are disorganized. So the factors of how we become organized is really essential. I'm going to look at a particular model that may be of use to people in the room. But we all know that violence is a symptom of a deep-rooted issue. You know, we can look at a range of different issues, and you heard me mention previously some of the things already. So we know that history plays a really significant role when we're talking about violence. You know, we live in violent societies, but that hasn't come from somewhere. You know, oftentimes violence is intergenerational. So it's important that we understand what that means. A lot of the violence that we find within communities, within countries around the world, is a lot of it is interpersonal, meaning issues that happen on an intimate basis. So for example, you look at me for too long, I don't like you. You step on my shoes, I don't like you, and I'm prepared to use extreme violence solely on the basis of those types of interactions. And we're going to unpack what those things are a little bit later. Poverty, we know, is a major issue in society. The impact of colonialism, lack of opportunities, high unemployment, poor or no education from young people or communities, essentially where people may come from, poor housing conditions, dysfunctional families, where there's issues around domestic violence, domestic abuse, or abuse in all forms. Resources for the youth is oftentimes limited. And then we understand why these may be factors to create those environments for violent behaviors or gangs ultimately to emerge. Trauma is something that we don't often talk about as it relates to young people that engage in behaviors. Poor healthcare, reactive policies, limited police presence within communities. We're not just talking about limited presence within communities, but also damaged relationships between police and community. Because if we're talking about resolving and stopping violence, then the police's role is to assist and to protect and serve. But if communities do not feel that the police are there in order to protect them, rather with the global debate that's taking place now around injustice and systemic racism, then how effectively are communities supposed to feel safe when you have those things ultimately at play? And poor leadership. And I think we can kind of go on about loads of different causes, and these are just some of the highlighted ones that come out in the research. And I think one of the key things is quite interesting now is that we have now COVID-19. And I think that in different spaces around the world, COVID-19 has also proven the fact that particular groups that are impacted by some of the things that I've just mentioned, even more so are engaging in risky behavior and violent activity just in order to survive, because the limitation of being able to make ends meet, the opportunity to be able to make finance and protect and look after families causes individuals to behave in a range of different ways. And I think from a research perspective, one of the key things that now is starting to be acknowledged is that when we talk about violence, violence ultimately spreads like a disease. And I think one of the key things I think is really interesting is about social media, because when we talk about the concept of violence within this context, we don't oftentimes talk about the role of social media and what social media does in order to perpetuate, sustain, and ultimately be a trigger or a catalyst to violence. So we're talking about young people utilizing social media platforms such as Snapchat, such as Instagram, such as YouTube, WhatsApp, not so much Facebook, but Twitter and other particular platforms in order to interact. And if we think in the context of COVID-19, statistics demonstrate that young people in particular are utilizing more social media platforms than ever before. I would even argue and say adults are utilizing. Why? Because we've had to. Like, for example, now we're doing a webinar on Zoom. The whole world are trying to find new creative ways of engaging with each other on social media platforms. So it's important that we understand those particular contexts, but also to understand that if we're talking about young people that are involved in violent activity, they're also displaying their behaviors on these particular platforms. Not only are they displaying their behaviors on a social media platform, but what they're also doing is utilizing social media as a platform in order to exploit particular young people that may come from a range of different backgrounds. So if we think that young people potentially are out of school, if we think young people potentially are coming from households where there's dysfunctional families, abuse, domestic violence, and these young people live in environments where they're poor and on the poverty line, individuals that are criminals will utilize social media platforms in order to entice them. But what are they enticing them to? They're enticing them to jewelry, they're enticing them to cars, they're enticing them to what? Clothes, shoes, trainers, whatever terminology that you like to use in terms of your footwear. But these are things that are enticing children and young people. So young people are making very risky behaviors on social media platforms with individuals that they may not necessarily know or have to meet in the physical sense. But I won't stop there, because then we talk about sexual exploitation of young people, and that also exists on a social media platform. So just like individuals that are involved in criminal exploitation of our young people, individuals that are involved in sex offenses will also utilize these social media platforms to engage children and young people in that particular context. But when we talk about violence in context, you know, we know that violence is not unique to Grenada. We know it's a global phenomenon. And then we can just kind of look at some of the global homicide rates, and we can just look at some of the top 10 countries that when we're talking about the murder rate per 100,000 people, you know, we can look at places like El Salvador, we look at places like Jamaica, Honduras, you know, Belize, we can look at South Africa, Bahamas, Brazil, St. Lucia, and we can look at all of these things. And I think we have to start to ask some very interesting questions. And I always say is that when we kind of look at global homicide rates, and as a criminologist and a social scientist, I ask some very interesting questions. So when we look at violence in context from a Grenadian perspective, we know that Grenada ranks 40th in the world as it relates to individuals based on particular homicides. But I think it's interesting because there is no coincidence. You know, there's one thing that these countries all have in common. And I just want you to look at that list, and I'm sure just looking at that list, you'll probably notice already what are the things that they have in common. So we have to start to talk about history, because history provides a very detailed answer to why many of the issues that we face in contemporary society. So one of the things that oftentimes we like to do when we talk about violence in a global context is that we focus on poverty, we focus on, as I said, the high unemployment, but we have to also ask fundamental questions of where does this ultimately come from when we're talking about economics of places like the West, and how did they, like Great Britain, how did they occur their wealth? So we have to understand that with all of those countries that's mentioned, that through colonialism and slavery, these particular countries, islands within the Caribbean, some parts within the East, have been ultimately destroyed because individuals have utilized the blood, sweat, and free labor of human beings in order to create their empires, in order to create the sustainability and the economic stability of their countries. And whilst doing that, other countries that have been enslaved, countries that have been utilized and abused, and their resources have been sucked from them, those same communities are almost in a rat race to try and get to a playing level field with those particular countries that's dictating how they're supposed to operate as a society. So when we talk about the impact of colonialism and we look at violence that exists within these particular spaces, we know that these places in particular are some of the worst for the way in which the slave trade impacted those places. So when we're talking about violence and we're talking about moving towards a space of responding to violence adequately, we as professionals, wherever we are, have to be visionaries. We have to think different. We have to think in a different context to how we're going to respond. So one of the things that I want to kind of bring your attention to is just more importantly, specifically what it is that what I'm saying. What am I saying that we're fighting? So we're going to become visionaries. What is it that we're targeting? So ultimately, we're fighting things like fixed mindsets expressed by our young people, expressed by our youth, thinking that the only way that they're going to make it in society is through criminal means. Toxic masculinities and narrative that are nihilistic. What do I mean by that? Young people that believe in a particular mindset or a toxic form of dominant culture that tells them in order to make it, you need to harm people. And you hear it in their music. You hear them make statements like get rich or die trying. You hear them make statements like I'd rather get caught with it, meaning a weapon, than caught without it. And through these nihilistic narratives, individuals that look up to them, that like them, that want to be a part of their groupings, also start to adopt these labels and start to express those behaviors outward. But then we also have to talk about those systemic failures, as I've just mentioned. We can't have a conversation about responding to violence without holding people accountable for what condition people have been left in. But it's also about passion and intellect, or passion versus intellect amongst professionals. What do I mean by that? And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of professionals that are out there that are very, very passionate about working with children, young people, families, communities, and reducing issues of criminality, reducing issues of violence in all forms in their local community, but have no knowledge whatsoever about the issues that affect our children and young people. So I say you can't have one without the other, but having both together makes you an individual that is a force to be reckoned with. It's a force to be reckoned with. And I think it's really important that we actually take the time to research, to explore, to understand young people. And people may ask me, well, how do you do that? I say the best way to learn about young people is speaking to young people. And as a youth worker, that is something that I kind of make part of my day-to-day practice. If I do not understand something, if I want to understand a particular cultural expression, I want to know what the new trends of music are, if I want to know what the new trends of fashion are, if I want to know what people are interested in, the hobbies, the experiences of young people, I speak to young people first. And then if you even say that you don't have young people, I'm sure everybody's got family members. I'm sure everybody has access to a community where there's children and young people, where you can start to understand those things. And then more importantly, one of the things that we're fighting as a generation of professionals that are visionaries to respond to issues of violence is systems that think short-term and not long-term. So again, going back and challenging that earlier point that I made about this kind of law enforcement, criminal justice mindset that short fixes solve the problem as opposed to creating opportunities or approaches that deal with issues long-term. So one of the things that I want us to think about, and this is just a concept, this is not something that's been done before, but it's something that I want you to think about. And when I was delivering a presentation in Jamaica, I kind of said something similar. And I believe this concept, if adopted, is something that I believe would bring forth some change. So I'm making a call, and I believe that this call joins many people, what I call the Violence, Desistance and Diaspora Forum. And what this is calling everybody from the Caribbean, everybody that has come from descendants of slaves. But what are we calling them for? We're calling them for those of us that are skilled in knowledge, those of us that are skilled in academics, those of us that are skilled in practice, that create a particular forum, that join our mindsets together to create ideas about change in a range of different contexts. Why is that important? Because the issues that exist within the Caribbean are the same issues that young people engage in right here within the UK. Because when I engage with young people, they are from Grenada, their family are from Grenada, they are from Jamaica, they are from St. Kitts, they are from Barbados, they are from Guyana, they are from all of these different places, young people that I engage with every single day. But there is no connectivity through those spaces and the children of the diaspora working together collectively to engage. So I'm going to let you know that I'm also part of what is called the EU Gang Network. And basically, this is a group of criminologists, all these social scientists, sociologists, psychologists also, around Europe. And what they do is they meet once a year. And these are some of the leading academics, some of the leading professionals, practitioners, if you want to call it. And they meet 1 to 2 days a year, creating a series of ideas and creating a strategic plan. And that strategic plan that they work towards for when they meet up for the next particular meeting. So it's a continuum. And as part of the EU Gang Network, it's give me the opportunity, as I mentioned in the beginning, to co-author, to co-write, to think about new models of practice. So when I make the call of the Violence, Desistance and Diaspora Forum, I'm saying, why cannot that exist within the context of all of these different countries that are affected by what I argue is the same systemic issues that's specific to those that come from descendants of slaves. And I think that's important that we have that understanding when we talk about connecting the dots between our experiences, whether that's in America, whether that's in the Caribbean, whether that's in Europe, no matter where that may be, the experiences are very similar when we're talking about systems and the way in which systems treat people. So in context, what would the Violence, Desistance and Diaspora Forum, what would it consist of? So it will be consisting of leading academics, professionals in the field of gangs, serious violence. I would also add criminal exploitation. The VDD will comprise of 3 primary objectives. So again, this is a concept I want you to think about. So number 1, it would be to build a foundation of knowledge regarding the socio-economic conditions and institutional processes that foster or curtail to social exclusion and subsequent emergence of persistence or dissolution of youth gangs or problematic groups within the European context of the disparate diaspora. Number 2, primary objective is to construct an infrastructure of comparative, multi-methods, meaning different approaches, cross-national research on youth violence in a range of different contexts, meaning we need to join up our understanding. So whatever's happening in Barbados, whatever's happening in Grenada, can we link those experiences to young people that live within the West Midlands, within Birmingham, within the UK? Can we connect it through our experiences? I'm saying yes, we can. 3rd primary objective, to disseminate and effectively utilize the knowledge to inform the development of effective local and national and international responses to emerging issues around youth crime, youth violence in all different forms. And I think that if we was to create a forum that had key stakeholders from different regions, different states, different islands, that are ultimately thinking about how can we collectively join our knowledge in order to disseminate information that can benefit those that are coming through the channels and are from the diaspora, I believe that we will have some really significant changes on how we respond to the global context of violence, because that's the problem. The problem is that we're responding to violence generally through local and national context, which is fine. But the point I'm making is that that global phenomena connects, because like from the UK, as I just previously mentioned, you've got an array of young people that haven't even connected to Grenada, haven't even connected to Barbados, haven't even connected to Jamaica and other islands, because that history has been disseminated. So how do we connect through our channels that we can work ultimately with each other to support young people regardless of where they come from, ultimately as long as that they're from the diaspora? So one of the things that I think is really interesting is a model that also can be utilized within this. And this is within the context of where you work. So you've heard me give you the vision of what a forum could be, But in terms of where you're placed, whether you're from Barbados, whether you're from Grenada, because I know that everybody that's in the room today are from different spaces and not just necessarily from Grenada. So one of the things that you can do in terms of what do you do tomorrow, in terms of how can we galvanize and start to at least have these conversations. So what would need to happen is key stakeholders would need to come to a table. So from a UK context, key stakeholders would be individuals like leading academics. And when I say leading academics, I'm not just talking about individuals that sit in a library all day and don't connect to their community. I would look for academics that function from an insider perspective, individuals that are known in the community, individuals that serve within the community, individuals that connect to the community quite regularly, that everybody knows who they are. So I would classify that particular academic as a key stakeholder. Your local pastors, your local imams, your local spiritual leaders, your teachers, your head teachers from local schools that are known to be quite proactive in reducing violence, youth workers that are well known in the local community would be classified as key stakeholders. Now, those individuals sit around the table and have a very key discussion. And with the key stakeholders that are a part of many of the groups that are set up in the UK, solely has one purpose. What are we doing as a collective to reduce violence within our community? So with those key stakeholders, we would then think about what does a research team look like? Because like with all proactive work that is done within any community, research is essential because we're able to look at that data and see whether that information, that approach, that method that you're using is effective or not, depending on the context that you come from. So those key stakeholders would work in conjunction with research teams, so your local universities, your local academics that would work in conjunction with the key stakeholders that have been labeled as academics. And then you're going to need a community of practice. And that community of practice can also include people from the research team, but that community of practice are individuals from the community, mothers, fathers, local projects within your community, local workers that have really interesting initiatives and ideas, and they would ultimately come together to support the frontline workers that are generally out there. So again, I'm going to just break down the model very quickly again. So your key stakeholders, an array of individuals that sit at a table. Those individuals would then inform another group that can be comprised of researchers as well as individuals from a community of practice, meaning people on the ground at grassroots level. And those individuals work together to help and support frontline workers that are going to be out there every day dealing with those issues. Because I know that there are some people in this room that are not necessarily frontline workers, but are senior managers, are team leaders, are supervisors that are more in a strategic environment around engaging with some of the issues that I have just mentioned. So you would be an individual that would be supporting the approaches in order to respond to the issues ultimately at hand. Because from a frontline youth work perspective, these are the key things that we need to understand, that youth work has always been an art form that I would argue has worked. When you look throughout the ages, even if we look within a UK, British context, youth work has always been an art form, a strategy, a methodology that has ultimately been used in order to engage in what I call society's ills. Why? Because individuals that are youth workers on the front line have always been individuals that have been formal in their approach to education. So informal education, ultimately in some contexts, has been more effective than formal education. So I, for example, in my experiences, have engaged with some young people that have never attended school. So me thinking about putting that young person in a mainstream school where they're potentially not ready for education at that moment may be something that is not as effective as engaging with young people in an informal way and teaching them the same knowledge, information, and skills as somebody would learn in a classroom, but in a very much creative type of way. Youth workers have always been spontaneous in the way that they engage with young people. They're versatile in the way that they work with different types of young people. Not every young person is the same. Not every individual that you encounter is the same. Not every family that you encounter is the same. And youth workers have always been and found ways and using different methods in order to engage, which leads on to my next point about being holistic, because utilizing a range of different approaches. So for example, you may be engaging with a family that's just had somebody that's died as a consequence to gun violence, for example. Now, you know, at that particular time, all of the practices that you're oftentimes given or methods or approaches to engage with that family in that particular time may not necessarily be the most appropriate, because there's going to be some points where you need to mediate. There's some points where you need to negotiate. There's going to be some points where you just need to listen. There's going to be some points where you need to give advice. There's going to be some points where you may not have the answers, and your presence alone is going to be more than effective than ultimately what comes out of your mouth. So it's about understanding that in different environments, utilizing holistic approaches is important. And I'll give you one more example. I was working with an organization when I was in Jamaica. And this organization was utilizing restorative justice as a form to reduce violence within local communities. Really good national initiative. Now, this was the problem. So when I started to work with the community workers, one of the things that they were saying is that when someone gets murdered within the local community, restorative justice is something that a lot of professionals are struggling with. And I said, I totally understand why. Because at a moment of murder and chaos and anarchy, sometimes restorative justice is not the appropriate method to start off with. So I asked them, did they understand any methods around mediation, negotiation, emotional intelligence? They said they heard of the concept, but never had training within those particular avenues. And that's my point. Depending on the situations that you're faced with in the communities that you engage with, it's important to know that there's some methods that may be effective and some that's not. So when you're looking at a youth worker and a youth worker that's trained, it's important to understand that those spontaneous and creative thinking in that moment becomes really important. And that individual also recognizes that conversation is probably going to be your most powerful tool, because you cannot force, you cannot change ultimately what's happening in the moment when an individual or family has been impacted by a traumatic experience. But through your conversation, through your mediation, through your negotiation, through your intellect and emotional intelligence will enable you to kind of decipher what the issue is at hand, but also putting things into place that's going to enable there to be a reduction in some sort of behavior, because what we don't want is the ripple of effect of retaliation. And that's what oftentimes happens within communities, is that when a violent incident has ultimately happened, people naturally go to retaliation because they generally feel two things. One, they feel that the help that's offered to them is not enough to deal with the emotion at hand. And number two, they live by a particular code that exists within their community, in their streets, or where they're ultimately from, that dictates to them that the only way to respond to a grievance, to an issue of such violence, is through retaliation. And that's the particular fixed mindset, as I mentioned previously, ultimately that needs to change. So we have to start to think more realistic solutions, more practical solutions to how we engage with children and young people that are affected by issues of violence and their families. So like when I just kind of gave you that imaginary concept of a violence and desistance forum, what does that look like in terms of practice Monday morning? The model of engaging with members of the community to create something, and I'm not insulting anybody's intelligence here, but you've probably already got very similar things. But when we're talking about public health models to responding to violence, there's one key thing that comes up when we're talking about public health models to engage with violence, is that they take an approach that is community-led and academically driven, which goes right back to the point that I just made previously. So utilizing this again, sorry, I'm just going to quickly go forward. That it's community-led but academically driven. And if you noticed, nothing in here says law enforcement. So where we talk about key stakeholders, yes, key stakeholders will work in conjunction with the police, work in conjunction with agencies. However, those agencies are not the ones that take lead on the particular model at hand. So if we look at places like Chicago, we look at places like Baltimore, we look at places like New York, we look at places like Scotland, for example, that at one point in time had high levels of violence. When public health approaches, opposed to criminal justice approaches, which I explained earlier, but a public health approach that they adopted was one that included two things, as I said, community-led, academically driven. Now that's a very hard concept to swallow when we have for too long allowed the state, government agencies to take lead of these particular initiatives around reducing violence. But what we need is a paradigm shift. What we need is a model and a complete restructuring of models on how to approach and engage in violence in a range of different contexts. And when we're talking about a public health approach, one of the things that I think we need to address collectively is the issue around intergenerational traumas. You've heard me mention the historical concept and the long-lasting impact of colonialism that still impacts to this day. Even within Great Britain, the history and legacy of colonialism still exists when we're talking about privilege, when we're talking about opportunity, when we're talking about wealth, when we're talking about the difference between those that have versus those that don't, when we look at the disparity within the criminal justice system, when we look at disparities within healthcare, when we look at disparities within education, and so on and so forth, we know that communities have faced trauma throughout the generations. So I argue that when we talk about practice and solutions, part of our solution, I encourage that we need to talk about healing. And part of that healing is revisiting what I call the crime scene, revisiting that historical context to help us critically analyze what are all of the factors that have enabled us to be in this particular space. Because whilst we're in this particular space, we cannot move forward until we start to have some sort of healing. And this is not about a blame game, but it's about the true acknowledgement of one's experience, that true acknowledgement of how we've moved as a people, as a society, as a civilization. And ultimately, when we start to have those conversations, we start to then think about the benefits of therapy. And then going back to my previous point about a paradigm shift, we then start to incorporate into our initiatives and programs the role of therapeutic processes in order to engage. Only now within the UK, we're now starting to have this conversation as we have a rising issue in our country around gang violence, whether that's to do with guns or young people carrying knives and harming people as a consequence of whatever issues, beefs or conflicts that they're engaged in. And only now we're having those conversations about mental health. Only now we're having conversations about trauma. Only now we're having conversations about, well, what does the role of respect, disrespect play in the role of a shooting? And these new conversations are conversations that I argue are ones that we should have been having many, many years. But it's also an opportunity to start thinking about new ways that we can engage with children, young people and their families in a range of different types of ways. So therapeutic processes is important. So part of our armor, whether you're a senior member of staff, whether you're a team leader, a supervisor, a frontline worker, being trauma informed is very important, that you understand that trauma and traumatic experiences can also impact the way that people think and the way that they behave. And being trauma informed enables us also to understand the mindset of young people that may behave in a range of different ways, because we know that any traumatic experience changes or redirects the wiring in the brain. So if a young person is exposed to constant violence and they behave in a very hypersensitive state all the time, trauma helps us to understand that, and being trauma informed helps us to understand that. But I think there's a wider discussion about healing, that even for us as professionals, we need to go through healing. We need to talk. We need to express our thoughts, our feelings, our hurt, and our pain. Because like myself, even myself, I have to go through a therapeutic intervention where I'm able to then talk about my feelings, my expressions, the things that I have to go through as a black male, for example, living within British society. And these conversations, I think, is really important as we start to move forward. So this is the end of the presentation. What I want to do is give everybody an opportunity to ask me some really important questions, and really challenging ones, hopefully, on some of the points that I've just raised. The model in particular, I'm happy to go back. I'm happy to move forward. But more importantly, I want you to ask some questions. So just before we end and we go into the Q&A, there is an evaluation link that's going to be posted in the chat. So that will give you all the opportunity to give feedback into some of the things that's going to be discussed throughout this webinar. And secondly, what I want you to do is, if you've got any burning questions, please write them down in the chat. I'm then going to call Pete in order to ask me some of those questions, and then we'll move forward. But in terms of contacting me, these are my details. If you want to get me on Twitter or LinkedIn or Instagram, it's an opportunity to do that. On my website, some of the articles that I have authored and co-authored, if you are interested in reading from a British context, I have done one that was kind of a cross piece of research between America, Chicago in particular, and London and Birmingham, West Midlands in the UK that I'm from. If you're interested in that read, please disseminate it amongst your colleagues. So now what I want to do is first and foremost, just thank you all for being a part of today's webinar. And I hope that the next conversations that we're about to have over the next 30 minutes is a fruitful one. So the floor is now up to you. Pete, if you have any questions, please send them over, and then we can go from there.
We currently don't have any yet, Craig, but I'm sure after such a thought-provoking presentation for the last 50 minutes, they will be on their way. Okay, we've got a question from Jude saying, it just came from a session where the same issue was at stake. How does a person respond to violence and threats against him from someone who is known to be violent? Part of the feeling is that there is no satisfaction going through normal channels.
Can you say that one more time, please?
She said, how does a person respond to violence and threats against him from someone who is known to be violent? Part of the feeling is that there is no satisfaction going through normal channels. Okay,
so what I'm going to do is kind of give you examples of the things that we do or have done within the UK, and that I'll hope that would try and answer some part of the question. I guess every single incident of violence is very different, so it's not the same. So I'm very aware of that, and I won't insult your intelligence on that either. So when there's generally a threat of violence that I've engaged with in the past, because I'm an individual, going back to the model that I mentioned around the community of practice. So if you remember, let me just see if I can find the slide, and then I will explain what I mean in relation to your question, if you will allow me. So with this particular slide that I just mentioned, so you heard me say that any strategy that the research has said that has been effective is always been community-led, academically driven. And that's the reason why I came up with this particular model that may be useful for individuals that are thinking about responding to violence locally in their community. Now, frontline workers, this is where it's important, because frontline workers that are assisted by a community of practice would be individuals that are well known in the community. So in the area that I particularly work, if there's a young person that's been threatened by another young person that happens to be violent and is known to be violent, we would have a number of frontline workers that are well known in the community on the ground that have been given mediation and negotiation skills, that they can go out into the community to have conversations with those individuals that are ultimately perpetuating issues of violence. Now, I'm agreeing with this last point that you made, that in some cases, there's individuals that are not necessarily going to be satisfied. This is where mediation comes in. So, for example, I was working with a young male, and he was being threatened by another young male that lived not too far from him. I would say about 15-minute drive from his household to this other young man's household. And this young man was intimidating him on social media, was sending messages to him on Instagram, sending messages to his Facebook, saying that when he's seen him, he was going to harm him. So when this young person told his sister and mother, they got in contact with my organization. And what we then did was found out the area which that young person came from. Why was the area important? Because I have workers that work in different specific areas that are well known to that local community. So let's, for example, they said, all right, the individual's name's Pete. One of my workers or myself knows who Pete is and his family. So at that particular point, myself and Pete would make our way to that particular household and have that conversation with that young man to, one, let him know that we're aware of the issue. And number two, let's bring forth a solution, because we're not the police. So what is it that's the gripe? What's the issue? What's the problem? And can we resolve it through a conversation? Now, your automatic response would be is that, well, nobody's not just going to listen to anyone like that. And that's why I said frontline workers and grassroots workers, because individuals that are well known to that community oftentimes have been given the respect of that particular community. So I recognize that with the skills and the knowledge and the love and the compassion that I have for the community that I work, all of the young people and the families are very clear and aware of what it is that I do. Now, I'm very aware that that may not exist. For example, in London, if I was to take this to London or come to Grenada tomorrow, I know that it's not going to happen. I'm not going to be able to knock someone's door and they're going to welcome me open arms because I'm a complete stranger. So that's the point. Those that are invested in understanding their community also recognize individuals that want a reduction of the violence. So going to those individuals and enabling them to come to a solution. Again, there may be elements that they may not agree with, but it has to be something that we're able to work with. And in some situations and scenarios, I found that to be effective. But the problem that I've also found is that some workers have gone into those situations and they don't know how to mediate, they don't know how to negotiate between families, between individuals that are ultimately victims or perpetrators of violence. And they're going in with the idea of, you know, can we just stop it? But nobody's ultimately giving strategies of what that stoppage ultimately may look like. So when you follow, for example, like the Chicago model of what's called violent interrupters, and anybody that is interested in some of the stuff that I'm talking about, you might want to look at Operation Ceasefire in Chicago, and they're also known as the violent interrupters. And this is kind of something that the UK have now started to adopt, and Scotland adopted the same model. So individuals that are in the community that are well known, that may come from backgrounds, at one point they may have been criminals, but those individuals are the ones that are trained to then become the negotiators and the mediators to any issue or activity that's ultimately taking place. And I found that to be very, very effective in local communities.
we currently don't have any more questions, Craig.
Come on, David, I'm looking at you. Come on, Bunny, I'm looking at you. Shirley Ann, I'm looking at you. Mary, Jean. Who else is in here? Jude, Josh. Come on, I know you got a question for me. Did anybody want any more clarification on any of the slides that I've just mentioned? Because I know sometimes that, you know, when you're coming from different regions, you know, I'm speaking from the first person, you know, from the UK, and I know things that are very different in different contexts. I am familiar with some things. So if there was something that I mentioned that probably didn't make sense, I'm very happy to quickly go through it again.
We've got a quick question from Hugh saying, how effective do you believe restorative justice practices are? He's saying that you mentioned that it may not be the option in a situation involving murder. So it's a question around restorative justice and its effectiveness in situations involving murder.
Brilliant question. I think it's about timing. It's not about necessarily is the approach effective. It's about when the approach is utilized and the correct timing of the approach. So if somebody has killed my brother, for example, I do not want a professional to come to talk to me about restorative justice because I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm upset. So I need somebody that's going to deal with those emotions first. And I think that's the problem. A lot of people that are given these methodologies and approaches, they're given these approaches as kind of the only method to be utilized at any given time. And this is why I mentioned the point about youth workers and why I believe in my position that youth workers are some of the best, because they utilize different approaches at different times. So time is essential. So again, it's not necessarily the approach, but the timing of the approach. So restorative justice is effective and has demonstrated to be effective, but something that you would use initially, I don't think it would be something I would think once that there's a healing and an opportunity for people to mourn, in order for people to be angry and talk through that anger, and for individuals to support them whilst they're going through that traumatic experience. Then restorative justice becomes an effective tool. But I don't believe that restorative justice should be the first approach initially when dealing with that problem. Pete, you're on mute.
Sorry. We've got a question from Jude again saying, is there a training program that you could take your workers through to prepare them for community engagement and mediation?
Yes, there is.
And then there's a subsequent question for that, Craig, saying, and do you have the support or involvement of the police to support your work?
To see your first question, yes. You would just have to make contact with us or the National Youth Agency. Happy to have a conversation about that. Do we work in conjunction with the police? We have to some extent. I guess from a community-led perspective, one of the things that we know is that a lot of young people, children and their families are linked to things like the church, linked to local mosques, linked temples, spiritual groups, or whatever it may be that people practice. So normally that's our door in, because normally the community are aware of it and an incident, a fatality in the local community. So we would generally go through the channels that are known in order to engage. And that goes back to the model that I just showed previously, is that those individuals that are key stakeholders, you're a key stakeholder for a reason. It's not people at random. It's going to be people that everybody's very familiar with in your local community.
And then Craig saying, there's a question around, do you also deploy workers to prison to work with persons who might be planning further violence when they leave prison?
Yes, so we will have, so wherever those young people, and predominantly young men that we work with, wherever they end up, we kind of follow and continue that intervention, while providing, even though for those that have been given a life sentence. Because one of the things that I'm very interested in as well is their stories, their narratives. So for those individuals that are serving life sentences for predominantly murder, I utilize their stories and then create workshops within local schools, primary schools, nurseries, in order to give young people that perspective from individuals that they may even know that have made some really bad choices.
There's a comment really from Pauline Richmond Mitchell, and I just wondered if they'd like to talk about that rather than me ask the question. It's more of a comment. Don't know if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask the question. Silence.
Everyone's quiet today.
Well, the comment is from Pauline.
Hello.
Oh, hiya. Go on. Ask your question.
Okay, it's not really totally a question, but I just want to bring some thought here. I'm hearing you, and Craig, I'm understanding all what you said, and it's okay. But we have to understand that as Black people, we were taught to fight. And we are taught to fight from since slavery. And that's the way we see it, because we think that's where we get force, that's where we're going to get some form of action coming through. And sometimes it's not the right thing to do to rebel when things happen. Communication, the only way we see it, with education and communication, we don't see it as forceful, because really, to some extent, I might be wrong, and people might help all here. To some extent, we think that Black people are not taken serious when they need to sit around the table and communicate or share ideas how to solve the problem. We are not taken serious. We are not forceful enough. But to see us come out and say, this is what I'm going to fight for, because it's like that is what we were taught to do, to fight for what we want. So to do all of that, we need to redirect. We don't only need to redirect the young persons, but we also need to redirect persons who lead these young people. We need to redirect parents. We need to redirect teachers, a whole wide scope of persons, because it's not only the young persons. Yes, we're going to get some change there. But what about the persons who create this mindset, who makes you feel that for me to find it there, I have to fight and not really listen to my words. My words is not solid enough. Me coming out to discuss the issue may not be that solid enough, but maybe I need to go out with my placard and I need to maybe fight for that justice. I mean, that's the whole idea I'm getting at. I don't know.
No, and you're spot on. I don't think I'd add to anything that you've just said. You said it brilliantly. I guess that is the reason why, when I kind of look at it in terms of structure, that's why I kind of gave the concept of what's already been adopted in different parts of the world. Question is, however, are we as a collective prepared to do it? Are we prepared to do it? Is the bigger question. As I said, we have the European gang network, we have the UK gang cohort group. So why can't we have one in the context of the Caribbean? It's possible. But someone needs to take forward and take leadership and utilize expertise around the world, because you've got brilliant people in universities across the Caribbean. I know that because I read a lot of their literature. But who are those of us that are going to be courageous in your context to say, this is what we would like to do, and we're inviting people to a conversation, and that conversation then links to another conversation, that second conversation links to another conversation, and then those of us that are skilled and talented, you utilize those individuals to challenge those in those prominent and political and powerful places, because everybody needs to know what their role is in responding. So for example, here within the UK, with a lot of the things that happen on the ground, those individuals have their place, have their lane in what it is that they need to do. But those individuals will sit with the likes of me because they know that I would speak to someone at the Home Office, someone at the House of Parliament, because I'm connected to those individuals that are in prominent positions. So that kind of working as a collective in terms of strategy, I believe that we can adopt no matter where we are. So it's more than just talking, it's also about the action, which is what you was saying, which I totally agree with.
There's no more questions in the chat, Craig. I wonder if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask you a question directly.
Yeah.
Good morning, Vonnie James, Grenada.
Morning, Vonnie.
All right, excellent presentation. As we go forward, though, let me just unmute myself. Right, yes. As we go forward, though, let me share about an experience in Jamaica.
Pardon, sorry?
Let me share about an experience that I had in Jamaica.
Okay.
I was doing internship at a hospital in Jamaica.
Okay.
I was at seminary in Jamaica, and an elderly man came to me. Well, he was actually lying on the bed, and he called me, and he said to me, "Tell me, why do you think all this crime and violence is happening here?" You know, and I tried to give some good sociological reasons and a number of thoughts. And he asked me, "Have you considered that crime and violence is a business? Have you considered that?" I was a seminary at the United Theological College, and when someone dies, for example, a number of people get involved. The police get involved, which usually have to get some form of money. The doctor get involved, who have to get some kind of money. The church get involved. It's not culturally here, but you pay the church, you pay the pastor, you pay the funeral home, and a whole heap of economics around violence and death, generally speaking. And I wonder if, when we look at policies and programs, that some of those things are not subconsciously laid out to create an economy around those things. And that's why you see having the cycle. It's not that it cannot be broken, it's that we don't wish to break it in many instances, you know? And with that perspective, I think we need to look at how does a policy of what I call an ordinary policy put forward by a politician, that, for example, becomes law. How does that help or hinder the issue that we are speaking about? And how do we look for the signs and symptoms? Because one of the things I deal with is something called whiteness. And of course, whiteness, and I heard you alluded to it, whiteness take the perspective that ours is the standard, and everybody else have to come to that standard. But in the context of violence and youth violence, how can we work within that context to say that I know what you are doing here, and that work there, that work in England, in Europe, in China, in Korea, but we are going to develop our model that works culturally for us. So it's just some thoughts around that, and to ensure that policies do not subconsciously or unconsciously bring in certain biases that creates those kind of things that I spoke about. Thanks very much.
And thank you for your thoughts, Vonnie. And I think I share everything that you say. You said a lot of stuff, and I was sitting there nodding from start to end. And I think first and foremost, you are absolutely correct. You know, that there is a whole economy around the issue of violence. You know, there's loads of literature. Even, you know, if you're happy, I can send you over some books that talk about a lot of the things that you're talking about. And if you just drop me an email. But in the UK, for every gun that goes off, for every knife incident that goes off, there's a whole economics around it, as you mentioned, from the moment that the police come, the ambulance service come, the forensic teams come, the moment that somebody has to go to the mortuary, and then as you said that, then the pastor, and then everything else. It is an economy. So one of the things that we have to start talking about is, when we're talking about reducing violence, how can we utilize the understanding of economics to reduce the issues ultimately at hand? And that's the reason why I was saying to point towards Chicago, because that's what Chicago was successfully able to do, is that they looked at not just violence from a epidemic perspective, from a public health lens, but also looked at it from an economic perspective and what it was costing the taxpayer in terms of the violent activities that was ultimately taking place. And to your last part of the conversation, I'm in total agreement that we need to have a paradigm, we need to have a model that suits us, fits us, and only responds to ultimately us. But how we achieve that is through the kind of globalized connective thinking that I can't sit here in the UK and think, for example, black young males that are predominantly more likely to be harmed by a particular gun compared to someone else in a small context is very different to a young child in Grenada, for example. So the only way that we do that is going back to what my proposition ultimately was, that if we created some sort of a forum that had those three primary objectives that I just mentioned, one, to build knowledge in regards to the conditions of people, which we are going to find similar, but secondly, which is your point, to construct an infrastructure. That's what needs to be created, an infrastructure. And that doesn't necessarily need to be a physical one in terms of human beings standing somewhere, but at least as a think tank, that those of us are sharing our ideas. So when you talk about your experiences in Jamaica, I can say that's the same experience that I had in the UK. Someone else can say that's the same exact experience that I had in America. Someone can say I had the same experience in the Bahamas, in Trinidad and Tobago, and so on and so forth. So that connectivity of our understanding enables us to put us in a position that can enable those that are creating and writing policies, that can shape those policies and hold them accountable to what it is that they write. And anywhere where there's been a model such as that, where there's had effectiveness, as I mentioned, Chicago, Baltimore, Scotland, that's where those figures started to drop as it relates to issues of violence. And I'm saying, if it's already been done, then why can't we replicate that in a context that makes sense to us?
There's one last question here, Craig. I don't know if you feel you might have answered this in some of the
Yes.
words you've just mentioned there, but what recommendations would you give to countries where the crime is pegged to political influence?
Oh, that's a very, very difficult one. When we're talking about violence as it relates to political, I think that happens or has happened in a lot of those same countries. And I think, going back to a previous point that I just mentioned, it's the mindset that we're ultimately challenging, because ultimately violence is linked to politics and it's linked to economics. So one of the things that I believe, that I think relating to the point that Vani just made about infrastructure, is I think that we need to at least have those conversations first. I'm not going to stand here right now and attest that I have all of those answers, but I think that if we can have better conversations from your lens, that I can understand that better, that with my knowledge and expertise as a criminologist and individuals that train workers to be able to respond in a particular way, we can bounce off each other. So in short, it's not necessarily an answer, but a call for us to connect, to have those deeper conversations, because I don't live under that political atmosphere. I don't live within that political environment. So I think it would be inappropriate for me right now to say this is what you should do A, B, C, and D without truly understanding from your lens what the problem is and what the issues are at hand, because you may know solutions that may connect to solutions that I found or we have found that's effective, and how can we merge that and change that together so it's succinct. I like to think that when I'm answering questions that I'm a bit of a realist. So I don't kind of like to give kind of these kind of magical type of answers that, you know, make people believe that, you know, this is the ultimate solution. You know, there is no ultimate solution. And I think this is why these conversations become important. But I think one thing that's, I think that is positive is that globally there's a conversation that's taking place that I think is different to what's been happening before. We've attempted to have these conversations. And I think one of the things that with what's been happening currently in America is that now we have people's attention. And I think now those of the diaspora are now wanting to connect back to their roots and connect with individuals across the waters about issues that affect them globally, as opposed to a local and national context. And I'll say it again, the issues that you're faced with on those islands are not different to what's going on in America and what's different in terms of the UK. Is that it, Pete?
I think that, yeah, that's it, Craig. I think, yeah, if we end it there, if that's okay, just like I said, that was awesome. Thank you. Very challenging, very interesting. So thank you for that. There's just one more question that I think you've already answered, but if you could maybe reiterate it. You're happy that people email you directly, aren't you, to ask you questions? There's some follow-up questions about the training program that you've talked about, and access to some of the journals and books. So I think you put your slide up or your LinkedIn contact at one point, didn't you? And then if we could just remind people that there is an evaluation for Craig's session that's in the chat. I'm going to officially end the webinar now, but if people could access that and fill it in, that would be splendid. So thank you for your participation. Thank you for your questions, and we will see you next time. Thank you.